Welcome to The Big Questions. I am your host, Robert K. Elder. On The Big Questions, we talk about love, death, sex, religion, and all the big questions worth asking. Today, we're talking with Jonathan Eig, my friend. He's author of the book, The Birth of the Pill, How Four Crusaders Reinvented Sex and Launched a Revolution. The Big Questions is sponsored by Shure, purveyors of professional microphones and headphones. Check them out at shure.com. That's shure.com. John, welcome.
Thanks.
Hey, so again, this is an amazing book, and it's about the advent of the birth control pill. But in doing this, I'm just curious what your own sex education was and how it prepared you or did not prepare you for this book.
My sex education probably relied heavily on Playboy magazine, and it did not prepare me at all for this book. It disastrously prepared me. I was completely unprepared for this book. My parents never talked to me about sex, and I picked it up the way most people do, just, on the street and from stealing my dad's Playboys. And he didn't really try to hide them that much from me. I think he knew. Mm-hmm. Sometimes he'd rip some of the pictures out, but never all of them. It was very strange. But that's really, had a big part in the way I grew up viewing sex, for better and for worse, probably mostly for worse.
Mm-hmm. But how did just research on the book change that? So you had this worldview, you had, you're an adult, you've had experience by this time, but how did it change the way you thought about sex?
Well, it dramatically changed the way I thought about sex. And I should say, growing up, becoming an adult, getting married, having two daughters also changed my view and began to make me realize that the world was very different than the way Playboy portrays it. So it's not as if
I don't know what you're talking about. No, I don't know what you're talking about.
It's not as if this was this dawned on me suddenly as I began researching the book. But what I realized in researching the book was that before I was born, and going back to the 1950s, when my mom was a young woman, the world was completely different. For women, especially, having sex meant having a baby. And you had to be prepared every time you had sex for the very good chance that it meant having a baby. And that is just something that we, as children of the post-birth control era, just cannot wrap our heads around. I find that even, fairly mature people in their 30s and 40s cannot picture a world where sex equaled baby and woman equaled mother. There were no real other roles for women in most people's minds back then. So I was really it was a big eye opener for me to go back and to realize what the world was like before reliable birth control came along. And actually, I don't know this. Are your mother and father still living? Yeah, they are.
So what sort of conversations did you have with them? Because they knew you were doing this book. Did you have any sort of cross-generational conversations about what it was like to grow up in, the 50s and the 40s?
Yeah, I did. And not just with my mom. I asked about my grandma, too, because my grandmother was very unusual. She did not get married until she was 35 and didn't have kids until she was 36. And for a woman in the 20s and 30s, that was really unusual. And I said to my mom, what was up with that? And she said, your grandmother wanted to have a career, and that was unheard of back then. But that's why she had no interest in men, no interest in getting married. She was really proud of the fact that she had this good job at a department store. And, but eventually she was broken down by what society expected her to be. And she always kind of regretted it. My mom always felt like she was not really like my mother, like my grandmother would have rather had the job than have had her. And that was the attitude that was the sense that my mother picked up, that she resented being forced into motherhood, by society's pressures. Now, my mom, on the other hand, was fairly typical, early 60s, late 50s woman in that respect. She got married at 21, had her first kid at 23, and then had 3 kids in a row very quickly. Was not on the pill, just didn't want to mess with the hormones, was scared by it. So it was interesting having these conversations with her. Certainly nothing I ever would have thought to ask her about.
Yeah. That's not usually Thanksgiving sort of a conversation. It was really interesting. There's a quote from Hugh Hefner in the book, how he talks about, I think in 1960, he didn't know any women who were not on the pill.
Yeah.
And that was, so the pill became, let me see, it was 1957, is that right?
It was approved in 57 just for menstrual disorders. But women figured out what it really did.
They used the off-label
but by 1960, it was approved as birth control. And Hefner said, I asked him, who was the first woman you ever slept with who was on the pill? And he goes, oh, geez, I don't remember the first, but I know that once it was out there on the market, every woman I was sleeping with was on it. that was, you know, the best thing that ever could have happened to him.
Well, and he calls it a powerful weapon. What are his defining terms as powerful weapon?
He likes to portray himself as an advocate for women's power, for women's equality, and for sex and for pleasure, obviously. But he says that he wrote editorials and columns very early on, before even a lot of feminists were picking up on this, that the birth control pill was a tool for women to gain power and to gain equality. And, you know, he certainly enjoyed the fact that it spread pleasure across the land, and that he was the king of that movement. But he, you know, maintains that he recognized very early on how this could change the world. Well,
and it's really interesting that there was, you know, some headlines recently, and I forget which company it was. Maybe it was Google, maybe it was Apple, who made public that, hey, we will freeze your eggs, we'll freeze your embryos. That completely opened up this firestorm. Like, hey, that's the wrong conversation to be having. It seems to be that this book sort of echoes forward.
Yeah, I mean, we're still having these debates because, you know, we're looking at ways that women are still unable to compete on equal footing with men. And the idea that they have to have their children before they get too old is not something, you know, men really have to worry about. You can, you know, if you're Saul Bellow, you can become a dad when you're 80.
Yeah,
and still
Charlie Chaplin,
right? And still continue to work. But you know, for women, it's a lot more complicated. You have to take time off from work. Usually, sometimes it interrupts your career. So the idea that these companies are talking about allowing, you know, paying for women to have their eggs frozen so that they can better time their decision on when to become parents is interesting. But it's still really complicated.
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to keep this coming back to the conversations you had within your family. And so as you were, you know, talking this through, how did it have an effect on your conversations that you had with your wife? Because, you know, she's the closest, you know, woman to you, and I'm guessing you used her as a sounding board.
Yeah, in fact, you know, I began this book in part because my wife was saying you should write a book that some women might want to read, as if they would have no interest in any of my other books. Right. How I perceived her comment, you know, taking it personally.
And for our listeners who might not know, you've had this long career as a biographer of Al Capone and Luke Gehrig and
Jackie Robinson.
Right. And
I admit those are not necessarily
chick lit books.
So I was a little sensitive at first, but then I realized that she might have something there. Women buy way more books than men. Right. I think it's something like 3/5 of all book purchases are made by women. So, you know, pretty smart idea that maybe I should try to write something women would want to read. But then as I got into it, and I realized, you know, I take birth control for granted. That's like, I don't like condoms. That's as much as far as the conversation ever goes, right? I don't want to have to use a condom. Right. So what are you going to do?
I was going to say, so you're male? Wait, let me. Yeah.
So and what men always assume after they declare that they don't want to use condoms is that the woman will take care of it. It's her responsibility. It's her body. She's the one who has to get pregnant and carry the child. So, you know, she should have to make the call here and take on that burden. But that's really not fair, and it's something that we need to talk about more. But as a, you know, fairly, I don't want to say typical, but as like a lot of men, I didn't have that conversation. I just, you know, let it go and figured we'd work it out somehow and it would all get taken care of. And writing this book has made me aware of the fact that, you know, I was not really carrying my end of the burden, that I wasn't being as thoughtful as I could have been, and that men and women need to talk about it. I think that's the bottom line.
Yeah. Well, and there are really interesting medical parts of this book because they dose the hell out of these women, especially I think in San Juan, is that right?
Right.
Who they're trying the pill out on, and they get basically 2 or 3 times the dose of estrogen they need. Not estrogen, progesterone. Right. Because estrogen was thought to be cancerous, right? Like it was a really interesting time in medicine then. Because the researchers weren't women, they didn't care so much about the side effects. Did your wife, Jennifer, did you have any conversations about that sort of thing? Because there's really interesting biological things that you as a dude wouldn't know necessarily.
Right. And you have to ask yourself, you know, as a guy, would we tolerate drugs that changed our hormones, that maybe affected our, you know, our testosterone levels a little bit, that changed our, you know, would we take a birth control pill that might make us lose our hair or have some swelling of the,
these are two bald guys sitting in it.
Yeah, so that wouldn't be a big factor to me, but no, seriously, they tried some of these early doses of progesterone on men to see what happened, and their testicles shrunk and they grew breasts and their voices changed. The men were not going to put up with any of those side effects, but oh, the women will they'll just amp up the dosage, give them more. You know, who cares if they're complaining about dizziness and migraines and swollen breasts and weight gain. And, you know, the men who were running these experiments really didn't care. And even today, you know, women who take birth control pills are still, you know, tinkering with their hormones. These are, you know, hormonal products. And it's, you know, it is changing women's bodies. And we, you know, never really fully understand what effects that has on our lives.
And the pill itself has sort of improved a little bit. They have added estrogen, which sort of balanced out some of the side effects. A company actually here in Skokie, in suburban Chicago, invested late in the game and helped mass produce the pill. What about and again, there was no government money, there was no university money backing this up. It was all privately funded. What are the obstacles to getting a male equivalent? Because it seems to be naively, the non-scientist, that interrupting a woman's reproductive cycle seems far more difficult than turning off sperm count or something like that. So tell me about the politics and logistics of that. What did you find in researching?
Yeah, they never got very far with working on a product for men. And you're right, it does make more sense to where they say take the bullets out of the gun, rather than trying to invent a bulletproof vest, right? But as I said, you know, earlier, there was really little tolerance for men's side effects, and it was a lot easier for these male scientists to tolerate the side effects as long as they were happening to women. But I should also say, in their defense, Margaret Sanger and Catherine McCormick, the women who were really behind this effort to invent the birth control pill, the people who had the idea and were funding this, they said this has to be something for women, because women needed to be able to take control of their bodies. And if it was something that they had to count on men for, it wasn't going to work, because men would decide when the women would get pregnant. And that was not something they were willing to put up with. They absolutely insisted that this should be a pill for women, that women could take secretly if necessary, that they could stop taking when they wanted to have children again. You know, for Margaret Sanger, the key word was control when she talked about birth control.
And Sanger herself, you know, fascinating, you know, women's suffrage movement. She was a big figure there. Is she sort of hooked up with McCormick, who is an heiress who helped bankroll a lot of this. Tell me a little bit about Sanger, because she seemed to be more about free. She seemed to be more about free love and more like Hugh Hefner before Hugh Hefner. So is that a fair assessment or no?
I think it is. And she comes at this, first of all, because she really loves sex. She thinks women should be able to enjoy it, and that constantly having babies is getting in the way of their ability to enjoy sex. It's getting in the way a lot. It's a big obstacle. So she has the notion that there ought to be a way for women to control their own bodies, limit the number of babies they're having. It would be good for their health. It would be good for their families. It would reduce poverty, and it would give them more pleasure. So she opens birth control clinics and she teaches women about contraception, but it's not enough. She needs something better. And she says, going back to the 20s, even 1920s, that what we really need is something magical, a magical tablet, a pill that would let women turn on and off their reproductive systems. But it's, you know, it's science fiction stuff. Yeah. And everybody she talks to says that it's nuts. It'll never happen, that the science isn't there. And even if the science was there, who would make a pill like that? It's illegal. Birth control is illegal in this country.
In 30 states, right?
Right. It was illegal all the way up to the 1960s. In some states, it was still illegal. So where's she going to find a drug company? Where's she going to find a scientist willing to work on this? And she's getting old. She's in her 70s when she finally meets the scientist, Gregory Pincus, who says he's willing to take it on. But, you know, for most of her life, she thought this was just a pipe dream.
Mm-hmm. But in terms of just her attitudes about sex and enjoying sex, was she sort of an outlier libertine? And how public was she about these attitudes?
She was pretty out there and pretty public about it. She had many affairs and left her children to go to Europe and to have a bunch of affairs there, and encouraged her husband to have affairs. When she married for the second time, she insisted in the marriage contract that they would have separate apartments and that her husband would not come over without calling first. So she was pretty radical.
And I want to come back to again the family and your family. And while doing research and going through all this, how did it make you feel about your role as a sex educator and about how you would talk to your own children about sex?
That's a tough one. My kids are 11 and 5, so the 5-year-old I don't have to worry about for a little while, but the 11-year-old is asking a lot of questions. She knows all about, where babies come from, obviously, but she knows about what I'm writing on. And she knows, she asks me a lot of questions about the book. I gave her a really cool illustrated novel about Margaret Sanger to read, and she ate it up, but she asked a lot of really good questions. And, it's important that they understand that, a woman does get to control her own body, that there are these choices, that there is birth control available. And I just think it's really important that women, even, young women who are I hope not thinking about sex for a long, long time, that they know that there's nothing shameful about contraception, that it's a choice. Sex is a healthy thing. It is a great way to express love for somebody. They don't have to have a baby every time, and they need to be responsible. They need to protect themselves against having children and against diseases. And I hope that I do a good job of teaching her that without getting embarrassed. I'm already blushing a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think both of us right now are beat red.
It's easier said when I'm talking to you than it would be talking to her.
Yes, absolutely. And I have 6-year-old twins, which is anybody who listens to this podcast is tired of hearing about it. But I am thinking about, I think I had a pretty open sex education. I think my parents were open. But you having no sex education, and again, having children and deciding to be more forward about it, how did this book even change that? Or, did it make you think about how you're going to tweak the message or the age at which you would approach it? Or, did it fundamentally change anything?
I think it fundamentally changed my view, in that I'm a lot more, of an outspoken defender of women and their rights in this battle, that men have been taking it for granted for a long time that women are just going to take full responsibility for birth control. And I just think that, I'm on the side of women now a lot more, that because I've written this book and because I'm the father of 2 daughters, that women need to be more aggressive, more assertive in making sure the men are participating in this conversation, and they need to be proud of their bodies and in control of their bodies.
Walk me just through historically how people talked about sex, because this started in earnest in, I think, 1950. So it took a decade, which is lightning fast in medical terms. But about how people talked and researched sex, because you had Masters and Johnson and Kinsey a little bit before that. But what sort of conversations were happening? Because I think there's this perception, it's my own perception, that there was very little dialogue about sex as recreation, period.
Right. Well, Kinsey really proved that when he came out with these studies and said that almost everybody masturbates, and that women have affairs as often as men, and that women actually enjoy sex. This was radical stuff. And the idea was that, in our puritanical society, was that women are only supposed to have sex to make babies. And that's what, obviously the Catholic Church teaches, but it wasn't just the Catholic Church. That was our worldview. And for thousands and thousands of years, that a woman is a vessel and her job is to make babies, and anything beyond that is just extracurricular, and it's inappropriate if she's having sex just for fun. We still have that kind of a jaded view. And, you look at ads for birth control products, okay? You look in the women's magazines, and the ads for birth control products say, you should consider taking this or getting a prescription for this so that you can go to college, or so that you can go to law school, or so that you can, postpone having your second or third child until you're ready. And then you look at ads for Viagra, and they're all about, well, God, you're a guy. You should be able to have sex whenever you want.
When the time is right.
Yeah, just do it. Just, that's a beautiful you got a beautiful young wife over there. You gotta do your job, man.
I love the fact that you assume, or the ad companies assume, that there's a wife.
Yeah, right. You assume it's a wife. It's probably not. But the double standard is absurd. Women are sluts if they like sex, and men are virile, studs.
And are men.
Right.
Yeah.
That's just crazy.
I want to talk also a little bit about class, because that's talked about a little here. Because again, one of the first runs, I think only 55 or 60 women had been sort of part of the testing pool until they moved it to San Juan, and priests sort of were railing against the pill that made the line, and that just, so they were sort of like free advertising. They just made the lines longer. So obviously poor women had a vested interest in reducing the number of children that they were having. But how ultimately did this reach across class lines?
It's interesting because, as you mentioned, in Puerto Rico, the average family size was something like 6.8 children per woman. So when the pill was presented down there and it was only experimental, there was this, great outpouring of this demand for it, and every time the Catholic Church complained, no, you shouldn't be doing this, the lines would get longer because the priests were just basically advertising for it in their sermons. So Sanger and the others really believed that this was going to be a great relief in poor communities around the world, that it was going to help control the population explosion. And it never really did. It really became much more popular in well-to-do communities because it was expensive, because it required a doctor's prescription, because you had to remember to take it every day and you had to get the prescription refilled. It hasn't been as effective in third world countries, in developing countries, as it has been in middle class and upper class communities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I want to take sort of a left turn here, because McCormick, again, who was the heiress, got interested in this. She was always interested in this, but the reason she was able to bankroll this is because her husband became sick. He was a schizophrenic, and part of her research, her desire to help him, and I don't know if cure him is the right word, but a lot of that had to do with hormone therapy. So in looking into this just a little bit, historically, schizophrenia is a really tough disease to control and medicate. Were they in the right direction? It's one of those things that they say, mental, as far as mental illness, schizophrenia is the one that just never gives back. It's this all-consuming monster. Yeah. So, in your research, did you find about advances that they made or treatments that were effective even in the early days?
Well, the hormone treatment was really new, and we were just beginning to understand how hormones controlled the body. And then we were toying with how we could apply these hormones manually to make the body do what we wanted it to do. Insulin, cortisone, these are things that we're just beginning to dabble with in the 40s and 50s. And that's where Pincus gets the idea for the birth control pill. The body already has a birth control device. It's called progesterone. And, and when a woman's pregnant, she can't get pregnant again because her body produces progesterone.
Right. The progesterone protects the fetus.
Right. So it was brilliant. And so they felt like hormones could do anything at this point. We just had to mess around with them and see what they could do. So the thought was, and Catherine McCormick's idea was, maybe it can cure schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. And they also experimented with it as an antidote to LSD.
Oh, really?
In the mid 60s. And Pincus himself did some of those studies. Yeah. So they were just they tried it as a baldness cure. They tried some hormones there. They were just trying anything. And of course they didn't get very far with schizophrenia. Or with LSD.
Yeah. So, but I was going to say the antidote to LSD was actually just punk rock music. That's finally what cured it. But no advances though were made.
No, it didn't do any good. But that connection, the fact that McCormick knew Pincus and knew his work with hormones, is what helped connect Sanger and Pincus in the first place. So,
well, and it's one of these weird things because Pincus had this not checkered past, but he was denied tenure at Harvard for being too public with his research. And then it wasn't birth control. He was more interested in livestock? Is that right?
Yeah, he was working on in vitro fertilization, and he was too radical because he was saying that someday we'll make babies in test tubes, and that scared the hell out of people. He was also Jewish, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism at Harvard at the time. But yeah, he couldn't find a job. That's why he was working out of his own lab, basically out of a converted garage. And that's why he was willing to try this birth control project when nobody else would touch it, because he had nothing to lose.
Well, and the thing that is, again, fascinating about the political part of your book is they really do this under the radar. And as you mentioned before, they talk about the research being done for menstrual disorders.
Right.
And in fact, that's how they get it through the FDA. Like they're just saying, no, it's only for menstrual disorders. And they only get it sort of approved. And then 3 years later, they, you know, when people are using it off label for birth control, that's when it really becomes a success. So I don't know of any other model where that's true. Like, what other drug came to the market that way? Because that's genius politics.
Yeah, and you could never have done it today. You probably couldn't have even done it, you know, a year later, because the thalidomide scandal hit, right, and the FDA got a lot tougher. But they had to fly under the radar, A, because they were working with no drug company, no university behind them. The Republicans should love this, because it's all like, you know, bootstrap stuff with no government funding. These are, you know, entrepreneurs, basically. And because birth control was illegal in much of the country, so you couldn't say, hey, we're going to run a test on this new birth control drug and we're going to give it to women in Massachusetts, because you would have been breaking the law. Yeah. So the fact that they were operating like this, as like these guerrilla, you know, warriors, really, it was the only way they could have gotten it done.
Well, and even after the fact, where they were still in danger of prosecution, right?
Yeah. By the time the FDA approved it, even though birth control was illegal in a number of states, the laws were not being enforced. It was too complicated, because women, you know, were out there using it all over the place. You couldn't arrest them all. Yeah.
Well, and I want to talk a little bit about the title of the book, and I think I disclosed at the top that we're friends. I've known you as you've been writing this, but the title of this book is different than the title that you pitched me when you first were talking about it. So tell me about how you got to the birth of the pill and what it started out as.
My original title and the proposal that I wrote to my publisher was "The Man Who Invented Sex,"
which is awesome.
I love that title, but I had a couple problems with it. One, my wife found it offensive. She felt like women would find it offensive, that it's all about a man. Yeah. Somehow I'm turning this into a book about a man. It's really a book about women. Fair point. Although I was a little bit resentful at first. And then secondly, the book really evolved so that Pincus is not the whole story. I mean, when I began writing the proposal, I saw him as the protagonist, but Sanger and McCormick and John Rock, were such strong characters. And you really could, if any one of the four had fallen away, had, you know, died prematurely, there would not be a birth control book. You really needed all four. And I began to think of the book more as a quartet, an ensemble piece, and not a biography of Pincus. So the title change was fair.
Yeah, but there's also this really great poem from is it Philip Larkin? Yeah. At the beginning. And I'll just read the first couple lines. And it's actually, I'll read the whole thing. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley Band and the Beatles' first LP. So the thing that I love about that opening line is sexual intercourse began in 1963. Let's talk that through, because I love the fact that you call them Crusaders, and I think you make the case for them being Crusaders. But what revolution did they launch? How did they invent sex?
Well, sex before the pill was very different. Sex, like I said earlier, sex before the pill meant you were going to have a baby, or you better be careful because there's a pretty good chance you're going to have a baby. And if you're having unprotected sex, you know, you might become a mother, and your life is going to change dramatically. Sex after the pill, or in 1963, as Larkin, you know, picks that year, which is really when the sexual revolution is coming into flower. Sex becomes something that you can really do for fun. And it completely changes the nature of the act. It completely changes the relationship, the dynamics. It changes dating. It changes what it means to be a man and a woman and a couple and in love. And what can you think of that's bigger than that? What invention can you think of that changed what it means to be in love? That's the pill. The pill did that. And it's not completely responsible for the sexual revolution. You know, there were a lot of other factors involved, including LSD and Hugh Hefner and so many other things. But the pill made it possible as one of the key ingredients.
I think that's a good place to end. You've been listening to the Big Questions podcast. My guest has been Jonathan Eig. John, thanks.
Thank you.